Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Hansen. I'm a 2L here at Colorado Law and secretary of the Silicon Flatiron Student Group. I'm delighted to be introducing our next panel, Emerging Best Practices in Using AI Well. This panel will explore new beneficial AI governance approaches that are often overlooked in media and academic spaces. We're fortunate to have with us an extraordinary group of experts guiding this discussion. Susan Adams is the founder of Women in AI Colorado's flagship program, Women in AI Labs, which has brought cohort-based AI experimentation to over 1,000 women across the country. Dan Linna Jr. is a professor of law at Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law and McCormick School of Engineering. His work focuses on applications of AI and data analytics for legal services delivery. Alexandra Robinson is the Director of AI Governance at Slalom. She is an internationally recognized leader in AI governance, AI cybersecurity, and technology risk management. Nathan Schneider is an author and associate professor of media studies here at CU. His work focuses on platform cooperativism, democracy, and digital governance. Moderating this panel is Harry Surden, professor of law at CU and the AI initiative director at Silicon Flatirons. Please join me in welcoming our fabulous panelists.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm the guy from before. Our panel today is entitled Nudging Artificial Intelligence Towards a Positive Future. So what we're here to talk about are the practical tools in our tool set, the norm, the institutional design, the grassroots movement that can incrementally make AI emerge in a pro-social way. What does it look like when AI goes right, and how do we get it there? So the premise of this discussion is that beneficial technological impact is something that can be actively constructed, and it may not happen by default if left to itself. And there are well-studied specific approaches that can make pro-social positive futures more likely: organizational, technical, legal, social, human, flourishing, checks and balances, safety nets, benefits and risk management. There's a whole well-studied tool set that can be actively deployed and should be actively deployed. And understanding these conditions for success is as important as understanding benefits and risks. So we're in a phase where the choices that we as a society make today in the next few years may shape the way AI emerges in the upcoming future. And this is actually empowering. It means our future is not being passively delivered to us from outside. It's that we as a society and as institutions can shape our own future actively. So just to give you an example, we're seeing this a lot here in the education setting. We as educators have both the opportunity and the responsibility to help our students thrive in the era of artificial intelligence and other technologies. So AI has both the opportunity to help learning, but also hurt learning. And we need to be careful for how we use it and how it displays. So just for example, we are and should be teaching our students how to use AI well and responsively through active interaction and reflection. As an example, we will have our students use AI in various activities and then step back and critically reflect on how is their AI use affecting their learning. Right? Is AI substituting or you're replacing your learning, or is it augmenting your learning? And we've seen this before. Of course, one of the primary reasons students come to law school is to train their thinking and to learn skills. And we want to encourage them to use AI and other technologies in ways that are enhancing that mission. So let me give you an example of substituting that we would say it's not really a good use of AI. So in law school, we read law cases, and part of the practice is understanding the patterns and the principles and learning to reason. So using AI to read a case for you and summarize it is not good. And we need to explain that to students. Why? Because learning happens through practice and insight and active learning. And in that case, the AI is doing the learning for you. By contrast, this is a very common thing among first-year law students. You read a case and you have no idea what's going on and you're confused. At that point, maybe AI can complement or augment learning. It might be able to provide you context, connect dots that might only be connectable by talking to a professor who might not be there at the moment. It can provide you with understanding to help increase your learning. So these are not obvious to students, right? Unless they step back and think and do an analysis of how their learning is either being helped or hurt by AI, they're not gonna learn the tools. So it's up to institutions like ours to actively articulate those differences to students, but more broadly, to be thinking about pro-social ways to nudge this technology in ways that benefit society. So with that in mind, we have a terrific panel, and thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction, who are going to be exploring what are the active processes we as a society and as institutions can make to make it more likely that AI shares benefits widely for all. So I'm going to throw the first question out to Alexandra. So it's kind of an abstract idea. What does using AI well mean in practice? But what is a concrete example, and we saw some on the last panel, of AI being used well today that deserves more attention? And what made it work? What conditions, organizational, technical, social, or governance related, were necessary for that success?
Okay, great. So I'm going to examine this question from an institutional and organizational perspective, because enabling the development of AI that works well really starts with your organizational strategy and a vision of leadership. At this moment in AI adoption, I see so many institutions feeling pressure to just adopt AI for AI's sake. Good AI development is rooted in your organizational and your IT strategy. We can't just invest in AI for AI's sake. If you don't know what organizational problems you're solving, if you don't know what kind of return on investment you're expecting, using tokenization or active use of AI as your metric could just be measuring organizational waste. And I see that day after day. When it comes to good leadership and deciding what AI gets developed, you need your clear yeses and your clear nos. And we're seeing organizations like OpenAI and Anthropic really in the heat of that at an organizational level saying, how is this technology allowed to be used? But even in small organizations, you need to have your clear yeses and your clear nos for how are we going to develop AI? How are we going to use AI? And that makes decision-making easier versus allowing teams and individuals to get stuck in cycles of ambiguity. So again, coming back to that leadership, any AI use case should be grounded in what are the problems we're trying to solve? How do we know that this works? And designing with users. I cannot tell you, time after time, I'm seeing development teams just forgo the basics of good technology design out of the rush to develop AI and say, we did this. The other part is having the hard conversation. So organizations are starting to enact governance more at the kind of big G governance angle and having the hard conversations. This is a great way that I see legal teams and compliance and privacy officers actually getting the seat at the table at technology. These conversations need to happen. They're hard, they're messy. At the same time, organizations to actually develop good AI need to make doing the right thing easy. So ensuring that people at the table in these conversations have the education about AI to apply their knowledge and understand how systems work to ensure these conversations don't get stuck in ambiguity and don't actually impact good design. That's on the organization to figure out those right mechanisms, upskilling, tools to enable those conversations, and then finally really making doing the right thing easy by embedding good design and governance into your tech stack. So the organizations that I see that are reducing their risk and developing good AI more seamlessly have embedded guardrails into their tech stack. They have embedded efficient testing and evaluation into their pipelines. They are upskilling their data scientists to be able to test for the social, technical, and cyber risks of AI, and they're making that investment so that it's not on the individual user or the system team to reinvent the wheel every time they need to manage the risk of a new product.
That's a great, so just to reflect back on some themes I heard in there. So you want the decision to be thoughtful and deliberate rather than ad hoc, done at the organizational level rather than pushing down on the individual users. We want the decisions to be evaluable in ways, is the AI solving a specific problem and actually doing what we think it's doing? So these are some of the great. Anyone else on the panel want to weigh in the same? Yeah.
Well, so I'd like to focus on applications of AI in law for my comments today, looking at how AI is being used in law practice, how AI is being used in courts, how AI is being used by individuals to try to close the justice gap. And one of the observations as far as some of the things that are missing is that we don't really have good understandings of how to measure quality in law, like understanding what good outcomes looks like, what good high quality work product looks like. And I think an early lesson we can learn is when technology assisted review and e-discovery came along. And so this is about 20 years ago. I was practicing law then, and I was very excited about this technology, but a lot of lawyers I knew and even judges said, well, but it makes mistakes. It's not perfect. How can we use this technology? It's not good enough. And I hear a lot of the same kind of stuff today about, well, yeah, I can't do what I do and it makes mistakes, but can't possibly use it. Well, then there was research done, right? And one of the things that's really missing is research in this space to understand how law is practiced. And Maura Grossman and Gordon Cormack did a really important research study where they looked at the human way we reviewed documents. By the way, how many people are law students in the room? Okay, a few. How many lawyers do we have in the room? All right, more. And in law faculty, or, you know, and if you didn't raise your hand, mostly lawyers, probably law faculty, not all. But they did this research to compare how well technology-assisted review did compared to humans. And if you're not a lawyer, imagine a lawsuit. You know, I did a lot of work representing General Motors. It's there's something about a dispute in 1995, and you end up with 500 bankers' boxes of paper documents, and the dispute is about the specifications for the steel in the wheels. And so you've got to comb through these documents. Well, is this related to that or not? You know, and well, it turns out you can train machines to make those decisions and do pretty well at determining if a document is relevant or not. And it turns out that when humans make those same decisions, inter-rater agreement is about 70% for the gold standard. Okay, so it turns out it's not nearly perfect. And this kind of underlines a problem where, again, we're not evidence-based in what we do in law. You think 100 years ago in law and medicine were kind of in the same place, communities of practice, and that really kind of drove the way people did things. Medicine took an empirical turn. It's not perfect, but it's much more data-driven. You know, they ask, well, you know, hey, what results in patients not dying, right? Let's do more of those things and less of the things that produce bad outcomes. And where I see this surfacing right now is it's tough to come up with evaluations to ask, like, well, what is good? I mean, people are worried about, we don't want ChatGPT to give bad information to someone who's trying to get back a security deposit or try to avoid eviction. Well, what does good advice look like? What does a good contract look like? There's more and more of a movement here to gather data around that, to understand, well, how would we evaluate that? What are the kind of things that we would measure? So it makes it difficult to do the evaluations to understand the validity of the tools we're using right now, that the reliability of the tools that we're using right now. But then it also shows up in another place, which is the data to train these systems. And so a lot of times, you know, the idea has been, oh, well, we can use machine learning, fine tuning for generative AI systems. We've got 5,000 contracts here, and the machine's gonna learn, right, how to write good contracts. Well, are those 5,000 contracts good contracts? How do we know? And so the field is improving in a lot of these areas, but I think that in some of my later comments, what I want to talk about, there's a lot of concern about how these systems can make mistakes when lawyers are using them and when self-represented litigants are using them. But I think we see growing evidence that these tools can be used across this whole space, judges, lawyers, individuals, to help them get higher quality advice more quickly, right? And we can talk about some of the main takeaway here, though, is that I think we need more research to understand, like, what do good outcomes look like? What does a good quality contract look like? And we just are really lacking in a lot of these areas when it comes to then being able to evaluate artificial intelligence outputs.
I think that's a terrific point. And you see a lot of stories coming out with lawyers that submit briefs with generated by AI with mistakes in it. But somebody who clerked for a judge, I saw a lot of human-generated briefs with mistakes in it, and we didn't really have a metric of the human error rate. Not to say that AI is necessarily better, but we don't know, right? It might be better, it might be worse. And certainly, I want to hear what you have to say about per se in people who represent themselves. There's huge amounts of errors there. Anyone want to weigh in on using AI well?
I want to double click on Alex's, the need for design governance and governance well, right? So there's a piece that I've been working on or thinking about is what could look like if we had governance that increases people's capacity to be the author of their own minds. So we keep going into the LLMs, we keep thinking about designing institutions and organizations. I'm coming at this from the human standpoint, and what could it look like to give people access to and a reflective practice into their own minds. And there's a new term that's coming up that I'm doing a lot of research on right now called cognitive sovereignty. And it's really about this notion of how do we stay the authors of our own minds in the age of AI. And I think that's the question that I'd even like to see at these levels of governance. Like, could that be a societal pro-social movement that we actually start to do that? And I'm experimenting with how we can engage in a metacognitive process of understanding the role that we're giving AI in any given task, which can then uncover, right, whether or not it's right or wrong. And I have the privilege of being able to do that at the university level, but also starting this Women in AI group. And we're calling it Women in AI Labs because we want to think of it as a laboratory, right? We want to center the human, center the woman, getting her in a space where she can both feel safe and trusted, but also be in that place where slowing it down enough to say, where is this infiltrating my brain, right? Cognitive permeability. Where is my identity maybe getting wrapped up in this AI? And where is it not? Not to slow us down, but to actually make us more and better capable of being a human being if we're going to engage with and get the benefit of this synthetic intelligence. So that's where I'm thinking about in this panel, especially when I think about governance. I want to see more of this either research given to, right, or how can we design the governance structures that would then foster that possibility.
That's great. And I want to hear more about that shortly. That's a terrific point. Did you want to say about using AI well? Yeah, any examples?
Sure, maybe I'll just join the kind of initial foray. One place that I'm thinking about this very much is our own location at CU Boulder. Where we just learned that the system has made a contract with OpenAI for making ChatGPT available to everybody. And one of the rationales used for this was equity. And I think it raises really interesting questions about what equity in this context could mean. I think it's a reasonable claim in certain respects to say that, okay, this is a, kind of state-of-the-art tool that lots of people are using anyway. Let's make sure that everybody has access to it. But there are a lot of respects in which that could be seen as inequitable, as for instance, ceding our choices to a company that is making choices for us. It's making the choices about where to put data centers, about how much land and electricity to consume and water, about what data to gobble up for its training, pre-training, and so forth, and so much more. What biases to instill into the models, which remote workers to employ to review CSAM material. There are so many trade-offs and decisions that we have seeded in the context of making a contract with a company like this. And I think that when we think about using AI well in the university, we should be asking, what could the university be doing to actually put different options on the table? And I see that as a really important piece of the university's role in society. And just to give an example, in Switzerland, the Swiss government partnered with a consortium of universities to create a kind of high road LLM called Apertus. Not perfect, it doesn't resolve every trade-off, but one thing it does is it doesn't use stolen data. I'm a beneficiary of the Anthropic lawsuit or settlement around book stealing, but this is something that the designers of this model chose not to engage in, and they were still able to produce a frontier model. Now I've been working with some of the engineers who produced it to create an inference cooperative so that the people who are using the tool are actually co-owning the servers and being able to make their own decisions about, say, energy usage. In my lab, my students are exploring the use of an LLM, and they're really excited about the fact that we're self-hosting it, so we're figuring out how much of our server resources we want to devote to this. We're embedding it in our conversations we're having with indigenous communities whose data we're stewarding as part of this process. We are owning the trade-offs, and this is an opportunity that we only get when we don't cede those trade-offs to a company whose goal is to lock our students into their products, create profiles of them, and have a group of lifelong paying customers and ad targets. Finally, I think there's a lot to learn from the lessons of worker control of automation in the past. Often what we found when we look across different countries is that where workers have power to guide automation, they're able to do it in a way that is friendly to workers, that automates the work they don't want to do. We saw this a lot in Scandinavian countries and factories in the 70s and so forth, compared to here, where automation becomes a site of conflict because workers know that it's going to be wielded against them. Even in a company like Microsoft today, in Europe, they have worker councils, that have been there just because of European labor law, and those councils of workers are deciding how to implement Microsoft tools within Microsoft offices. How else could we make this a worker-driven process? And just to give an example, for instance, we might think about Hollywood, for instance, and the way in which they used labor power to set the terms, to try to set some terms for the use of AI. But also in the context of a law office. I work a lot with a law firm here in town that has employed a worker-owned cooperative tech company to develop internal tools, self-hosted AI tools to help facilitate their legal work and making sure that the workers' voice is at the front, both in terms of their choice of consultants, but also in terms of the development and deployment of their tools in the workplace. So I think when we cede our choices to a big company that says, we will provide AI, period, we cede so many interesting conversations and sites of experimentation that we could be doing around this technology. And it's that kind of experimentation that I hope our universities and many other institutions in our lives take up.
Those are really great comments. And just for the audience to take a step back, in law school, we talk a lot about top-down governance. You might imagine a statute or regulation passed by Congress or state government or local. What I'm hearing from you is a different model of grassroots, community governance, community norms. Can you say a little bit more about that distinction more abstractly and some of the benefits of thinking in that mode?
Yeah, I mean, I think these things are related, but if we've learned one thing from the history of regulating the internet, it's that this government doesn't do much of it, and that a lot of it is going to be left to the civil society, and we need to take that up. We need to also recognize that what we're living through right now in the context of the tech industry's relationship to the military, for instance, is the result of a labor struggle. During the last Trump administration, there were massive walkouts and organizing drives. In the time in between then and now, there were massive layoffs that severely hampered that resistance to engaging in irresponsible military contracts. Right now, one of the things that is trying to hold the line is Anthropic's corporate structure, which has some values built into it that can create some real pain for the company, akin in some respects to what we saw with OpenAI a couple of years ago. But I think right now, if you just look at the scene right now, a lot of the real bulwarks are not coming from policy, they're coming from the kinds of things that people can erect and practice through contracts, through social movements, resistance to data centers. And policy is probably going to come in maybe in a few decades and pick up the pieces and resolve settle things once the dust has settled. But there's a lot that needs to happen between now and then to determine the shape of any outcomes we find.
I hope it's not decades.
Well, if you look at social media, it's like they come around to regulating it as soon as Mark Zuckerberg is like, we're not a social media company, we're just like delivering AI slop all day. So like the moment social media stops actually being the driver of value is the moment where Congress is like, maybe we should pass a law about social media.
Anyone want to weigh in on bottom-up governance, where they're seeing communities or social practices in the absence of formal regulation or augmenting or substituting for formal regulation?
I mean, I'll say here in Boulder, we're experiencing an incredible, and I'll just put a shout out to Dan Murray, who's in the audience. We run and support a meetup group that literally went from like 50 members to 800 for women in AI in 2 years, in 3 years, 3,000. I mean, that's grassroots. And all we're doing is a monthly meetup. We're sitting in conversation and we're solving problems by being in conversation. And we're doing it out of the goodness of our own hearts because we see the need. But we became this vortex, right, of thank you for allowing us to be in an expression of ourselves, a real concern for what's happening. And then moving forward to say, can we solve this together? And I really do think it requires that community, and I want to see more of those spaces. And we're here today in that same vein, and just appreciating that this is an aggregator in some ways, right? It's very confrontive for people, and so even with faculty, I watch the 5 stages of grief, and still faculty cry with me in feeling so confrontive that their entire discipline is, in their minds, destroyed until they can move forward and see, actually, there is a way we can empower and be with my discipline if we roll up our sleeves and think together in a community to solve for this. So that's an example I want to see more of and be watching kind of that progression of our society, really, almost the consciousness of our society as we continue to meet together.
Yeah, what I love about that, I hear you and Dan and others taking an active role in trying to shape the society you want rather than sitting back passively and have it being done to you. Yeah. And we all have that opportunity.
Well, in terms of being active too, I think the courts is another area where we need to be much more active. And I think in all these spaces, we should think about top down and bottom up, both innovation and regulation. And you need people who are closest to the work to understand how these tools can be used to truly innovate and deliver great results. So you've got to train them. They need to understand the benefits and the risks, and they need to be part of your governance structure. They play a very important role. So it's both top down and bottom up. And then just when we think about courts, one of the huge issues here is that courts are not well funded in the United States. And for the federal government, they can, they're working on, I think some of the judges are working on trying to address this at the federal level. They've got better tools, generally speaking, but many state court jurisdictions, you talk about using Westlaw or Lexis, and they don't have a subscription. And say, well, you don't need a policy about these hallucinations. You need to use the technology that can help you identify hallucinations. Well, we don't have a subscription, and I don't want to, go and try to beat up our local leaders to get the money to do that. Well, if we want to modernize our courts, we need to figure out how to give them funding so they have the technology tools, they have the staffing, they have the training, and we're woefully inadequate in those areas.
I'm going to be a bit of a pessimist here, but not forever. So I think that there's a real power imbalance in terms of shifting big tech and model providers' behavior for the next few years because they are subsidizing the cost of their models and expecting consumers to embed OpenAI and Azure, whatever it is, into their tech stack so that you're addicted to it and you're stuck. And the prices of compute right now are so subsidized and it is not feasible to sustain forever. And when those prices come up, you're going to have very angry customers and companies whose business models and FinOps are out of control. And then you'll have, I think, a backlash. When you have these data centers being built and enough people are physically affected by them, that they can't sleep, that they can't go outside because of air pollution, that your energy costs are up 500%, you're going to see a backlash. But that's going to happen in 2 years. And I think civil society needs to think really tactically about how they're going to harness that energy. I think corporations or consumers of enterprise AI technology can start demanding transparency from their model providers and their cloud providers. So borrowing from the ESG space, when you're having contract negotiations or when you're comparing cloud stacks, ask for transparency about where data centers are hosted, what are the energy resources fueling them, what are their community protections, what are their model policies, do they allow use of models for autonomous war, whatever. But these are things that companies can start asking now, and if there's a unified way of asking for that information, we can start benchmarking that more transparently. But model providers are not very transparent or forthcoming about their compute, about their data center use, and that puts a lot of burden on consumers to demand that. And we're not going to get the regulation under this administration that would force it. I think Europe will come out ahead, but we are always going to be behind in terms of using regulation as a lever to combat big tech power dynamics.
No, I think it's a great point. I think the ESG movement showed that bottom-up pressure from customers actually can result in real-world change. I think it's a terrific and optimistic point, actually. I thought it was...
Just delayed optimism.
Delayed optimism. Susan, I want to return to your earlier point about cognitive sovereignty. Could you say a little bit more about that and how sort of deliberateness in our relationships with technology can promote or at least nudge flourishing and thriving?
Yeah. Well, I'm really in the experiment phase of it right now. I'm designing a course down at DU for this where I'm hoping, or at least I'm looking at, is there going to be a transformation from even week 2 to week 10 for a student that begins to take that reflective stance, even in the midst of building projects and thinking about automation flows? Would there be power and benefit to taking that step back? Or is it even a step right beside? So I'm thinking about words like metacognitive agility, right? So being able to be agile enough to have that pause point to make a choice about how much is this influencing my thinking. And I'm mostly, in a way, concerned about the 15 to 22-year-olds. I mean, that's where there's such an important developmental stage for our own identities and our own ability to be in the practice of thinking. And yet, when I'm also in my Women in AI labs, I still see it in adults too, right? So I don't think it's necessarily an age piece. if we imagine, what does it mean to develop our minds over time? But this technology, this synthetic intelligence, is the first time we've actually had a mirror to ourselves. So I think that has the potential for us to actually see our thinking patterns for the first time, to recognize what our biases are. And, there's going to be a lot of research and a lot of even wringing of our hands of the bias of the algorithms. That is going to be true, and I can help with that. But I'm much more interested, and I think we need to be putting just as much research and experimentation into our own minds and our own bodies in terms of raising that capacity. So that's where the cognitive sovereignty frame comes in, and I almost want to encourage every university to have a lab that helps us look at that and how we raise that capability.
Yeah, I really love that, because I think we've all experienced a lack of cognitive sovereignty in social media and smartphones, where some of us mindlessly scroll through things, not reflecting on our relationship with our device, and also not reflecting on the view of the world that we're getting. We think what's coming through our feeds is a reflection of the way the world is, not a skewed and algorithmically presented view of the way the world is being presented to us. So taking metacognition in a relationship with AI, taking a pause and think, what is AI giving me? What is my relationship to this information? Developing critical thinking in society is really important.
And I think the environmental question, Alex, you bring up, a professor was speaking to me recently, and actually you and I talked about this last night, is this idea of the Faustian bargain, right? We have to bargain with, 8 glasses of water for every interaction with AI. Mm-hmm. And that's a trade-off for the fact that you also watched a Netflix movie last night, or you took a plane to a conference and you got the exchange of being on that plane to actually be in a conference and learn something and maybe get a new job, right? We're bargaining every single day. And I think that's another reason to have this cognitive sovereignty, this, our brains are online enough to be in that space to know what that bargaining is. And in so many ways, that is deeply personal. Mm-hmm. And yet we are at the helm and the front lines of institutional policy and governance and needs. But to me, that needs to be in service to that individual coming to these themselves and those decisions themselves. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would argue, I think it's got to be both individual and collective. Like any sovereignty, I think, is in some respects collective, and these decisions have to be collective. In the same way that the trade-off I take by taking a flight to visit my relatives in Ohio could be different if, for instance, our government invested in high-speed rail across the country. Right. That's a collective choice that we could make, or maybe that my organization chooses to use a provider that uses renewable energy for AI or something like that, makes an intentional choice. And also one thing I've noticed is that my personal choices get affected by the culture around me. I have a lot of colleagues who are really skeptical of a lot of AI use, as and more than me. And it actually has been forcing me to be more intentional, and I've been appreciating their skepticism, because I'm like, did I really understand that thing I just got out of that bot? And that's a really important practice. One thing I'd also add is I like the thing I scroll on is not like TikTok. It's like threads of software engineers talking to each other. Like, I don't know why I get so much pleasure out of this, but it's really interesting to see the kinds of practices developing in the kind of engineering rigs that people are developing to do what they view as like responsible software development with AI. They're building all kinds of agents.md files and workflows and specifying what they're doing. The creator of Claude Code recently posted his Claude.md file, and it's all about developing intentional practices through ongoing relationship with these machines. And I think that's a useful personal practice to develop, to recognize, again, that like the tool as given might not be a responsible thing to use, but you can cultivate your relationship with the tool. Your organization can, as you said, cultivate a responsible apparatus infrastructure that makes, for instance, a kind of cognitive sovereignty, not a burden that we impose on the individual, but is something that we as a society are cultivating together.
Thank you.
I want to pick up on you said early on, Harry, about we have a responsibility to teach law students to use this technology responsibly and well. And I think more and more law faculty are saying that we need to teach students to use it responsibly, maybe not the well part, but I fear, unfortunately, that that's still the minority opinion across all of law faculty in the U.S. But I also think that we need to kind of change our mental models of how these tools are used and demonstrate how these tools can actually be used to accelerate learning. I think back when I went to law school, I was required to do research in the books before I was allowed to touch a computer, and most of my faculty were convinced that I'd never be a real lawyer, a good lawyer, if I didn't know how to use the books and find that pocket part in the back. That didn't last very long, and before we realized, well, let's just go use the computers and do research. I think we're going to be there pretty quickly with AI. I think it's pretty much already here. Any sort of policy that AI is banned is totally, you can't administrate it. I think it's coming in many opaque ways into how students use these tools. So we should be teaching them how to use them, and we should be building tools to help them. And just a couple quick examples I want to give. I've been creating conversational AI tools in my writing classes. So 3 different ones. Students interact when they choose a paper topic, and it forces them to think about who's the audience? Why do I want to write about this? What is the scope of this? Should I narrow the scope? And then they turn in a transcript of that. Same thing when they create an outline. So I broke the writing process down into phases. They have to come up with a thesis statement and then write a full sentence outline with topic sentences. They iterate with the AI assistant that I've created, turn in that transcript, and then I give them feedback in the outline. They turn in a final paper, same thing. In our innovation lab, we're creating a moot court simulator. So it's an avatar of a judge. Some of these are already out there. Some law firms are using this. People's Law School in Canada created something like this. But the idea is you put the briefs in. You have to go to court and argue a motion, or you're arguing in front of a court of appeals. You load in the briefs. You could even give the system some of the opinions that the judge has written in the past, and it will ask you questions. It will moot you. And of course, as a practicing lawyer, I did this, and if you're in a law school, you can have a professor do that, but there's not nearly enough time to do as much as you would like. So having these simulations could really accelerate learning. I think, we're just barely scratching the surface in the way that we can use these tools to accelerate learning for students, and we have to stop giving the easy option for faculty of banning the tools because it's cheating, right? We need to be a little more thoughtful about how these tools can be used responsibly and well.
This is a great point, and this follows up on a point you just made, which is it's forcing educators to see what aspects of existing education are just artifacts of the way things were, whether it's, the 5-part essay or
Which really was a proxy for critical thinking.
Exactly, or the Westlaw keynote paper, right? And which parts are actually important to learning, and we should be open to understanding what was valuable about the old system, but also not clinging on to it if it is there as an artifact and it's not helping our ultimate goal, which is helping our students learn and thrive.
I love Susan's point about the stages of grief.
Yeah.
Guilty as charged, I mean, my first year, I was just doing lots of honor code reports and feeling very angry with my TAs and about all the slop we were getting. And then I started realizing, this is just actually shining a light on a lot of rote, kind of unthoughtful assignments. And I've turned a lot more toward orality, which was I think old-fashioned education was about memory and speech, right? And I think this is an opportunity to come back to that and to recognize the way in which we've been leaning on, the college essay in a way that, that has become corrosive. One thing, too, that I've found in my classes is that when you actually turn what they're turning in over to each other, they start coming to some interesting conclusions themselves. Again, this, to me, comes back to the question of what would it look like if you had your workers in a workplace talking to each other about what they really want out of these tools is, when students start having to see and think through and respond to each other's work, they are just as annoyed by slop as I am. And, which isn't to say that they, think AI is terrible, but they can see the difference between something that's thought through and something that was, a one-shot prompt. And that to me is really exciting, is that actually this is an invitation to get back to basics, to hold spaces together, to think together. One thing I'll just add too is we did an event on AI earlier this week, and kind of raising questions about the ChatGPT deal. A group of faculty from across campus, and it was a bunch of faculty talking at people, unfortunately. But then the students started speaking, and one of them talked about a petition that he had created to get his professors to stop doing bad AI stuff on their work, And it was because they'd had professors who wasted their time with bad AI tests that actually were unsolvable. And so that the professors were being lazy. And that was a reminder to me of just how important power balances are throughout this, is that, one definition of AI is an attempt to centralize power that was previously distributed. It's an attempt to automate and centralize. And we need to be really, really attentive to the temptations of using this technology as a way to assert power over others. And what I've found is that when you realize that you're doing that, and you break it down and you shift gears and you open up a conversation, really, really interesting stuff emerges. Just like the students in that classroom actually realizing that there was a problem and encouraging each other to do better.
I'm glad you mentioned oral exams, because that's something I should have mentioned. That's something else I'm incorporating with using these AI tools, and also things like peer reviews. And I think especially in professional schools, we too often design education so that students learn from the professor only. And it's like, we have amazing students in law schools all across the country. How do we create more opportunities for the students to learn from each other as well? So just some changes in the design of the course to accelerate learning, faster learning.
I love that. And another example of kind of bottom-up governance. Alexandra?
Yeah, one thing I would caution here is universal standards or expectations of what using AI well means. What I'm seeing in corporate America is a CEO or someone in power equating using AI equals using AI well. If you had a CEO that was like, our big initiative this year is teaching people how to parent, and their outcome was everyone has kids, you'd think that was insane, because your workforce is not homogenous, and people's relationships with technology is not homogenous. Their backgrounds, their barriers, their experiences in society with technology is not homogenous. So we're seeing that women are 25% less likely to use commercial Gen AI tools than men. And from the CEO corporate perspective, where they're saying, if you don't want to use AI, then you're not a good worker and get out, like you're obsolete. That is coming from the assumption that suspicion around a technology is bad. Whereas I think this panel would say that being critical of a technology, being critical of its outputs, actually makes you a good user, and that you're a better equipped user of its outputs. So where are those biases coming from? How do we switch that? And how do we actually look at our student population or our workforce not as homogenous, but take that human-centered perspective, take a social technical perspective, and meet people where they are, and also give them tools and training that actually meets their needs and their jobs. Like if I just roll out Copilot to my entire workforce, of course, some people are going to be excited and trusting and using it, and some people are just not going to know how. And if I give them a one-day training where everyone is in the same room, there are a lot of people that aren't going to feel safe asking questions or sharing their concerns around, is this being used for worker surveillance? Like, is this is this training me out of a job? So you have to create those spaces for your entire workforce, meaning all of your subsets of your workforce, to adopt a tool that meets their needs.
I love that, and it reflects an earlier theme about AI adoption not being reflexive, but being deliberate, thoughtful, and nuanced at the organizational level. And I think
I also just really want to lift up that surveillance point. I think it's a really important issue, and it's real for a lot of workers. And, in the same way that social media, was about capturing a previously non-commodified thing, relationships, and turning it into a commodity. These tools have the potential to turn thought into a commodity. If, the more that we lean on these things for our thought processes, and we cede the power and control over them to companies outside of, much more powerful than us, or even our employer, it's a real move, in addition to the domestic surveillance issues that come up. And I think it's absolutely essential to draw really, really hard lines around the way in which data flows, and the way and what is protected about our interactions with these machines. It's one reason why, it's something we talk about in my family a lot, use local models for anything personal. I mean, something I do in my practice, like if I'm thinking through something that has any, I don't know, that could expose me in any way, I'm going to use a slow local model sitting on my computer. And one thing a slogan we have in my lab is friction is a teacher. The things that are hard, that corporations make hard for us, are often a reminder of how power flows. If it's hard to use a computer system that is private, that shouldn't be a reason not to do it. That should be a reason to recognize that somebody has an interest in seeing every thought that's running through our mind. And we need to resist this commodification of thought at all costs. Like that has to be an absolute bottom line for any relationship with this technology.
Thank you. Dan, I want to turn to you. So I think one of the concerns we have is even if AI brings more benefits than risk, which I am optimistic it will, as looking at past technology trends, the benefits are not evenly distributed. Certain groups of societies disproportionately bear the costs, and the benefits don't necessarily get widely shared if not intentional. So can you say a little bit in law, ways we can nudge it down a positive path? And
yeah, well, I'm going to talk, if I haven't upset any of the lawyers in the room yet, I'm going to talk about lawyer protectionism and I think some of the problems in this space. And I do think these tools have tremendous potential for improving access to the law, access to justice, helping individuals understand their rights, understanding their obligations. And even before language models, we've seen that, building expert systems, tools to help people. It's not a panacea, and there's a lot of obstacles beyond even just building the systems. But there's legal aid organizations who are building tools, there are courts who are building tools, and I would argue, based on the experimentation I've done and the research I've seen, ChatGPT is better than nothing for individuals, and that's the choice for many individuals. They can't afford an attorney, and they're not going to be able to get a legal aid attorney. Unfortunately, though, there's a growing movement of lawyers and some judges creating a lot of obstacles to individuals getting access to these tools. One is unauthorized practice of law, and that's been playing out for a little while. But then even one other piece of this is just some of the judges' policies in courtrooms. And so disclosure policies, some judges said, hey, if you use AI, you have to disclose, which creates a chilling effect on lawyers using it. And maybe also on self-represented litigants, although they're probably unlikely to be reading the standing orders of judges. Most lawyers probably aren't reading the standing orders, particularly the ones who are making big mistakes using these tools. But even more troubling to me is a handful of judges have purported to ban the use of these tools. And, I need to make more progress on a law review article that I've been wanting to write, but I think there's serious constitutional issues with that. Due process issues, First Amendment issues. I mean, absolutely, once you file something with the court, if the judge wants to sanction a self-represented litigant for hallucinated cases, they can do that. I think it's a bad look. More and more state judges are realizing that. But, how can they dictate what you do in your own home to do legal research and try to, prevent yourself from being evicted, for example. So I think those policies are problematic. And then now we're starting to see unauthorized practice of law, some jurisdictions wielding this as, there's concern here about protecting consumers, right? Absolutely. But unauthorized practice of law, we've seen some, chipping away at the foundations of this. In the state of New York, there was this Upsolve case that went up to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, but it wasn't computer research, but we see that you can kind of like see the pathway to unauthorized practice of law, in my opinion, is going to go away. And we're not going to, it's overbroad. It's unclear what that means. And so what that means is not that you can do whatever you want and any AI provider can provide services to individuals, but that we'll need to think of different ways to regulate these systems. And if you want to provide legal services with an AI tool, does that just simply mean you need to register with the state? Is there going to be some sort of an audit? Different states are thinking about this. There's a sandbox in Utah. Arizona's been changing their rules. I spoke to people in the state of Maryland recently who are thinking about some of these questions. And then, so we've got to think about proper ways to regulate. And I think in a lot of ways, ChatGPT is better than nothing. Are we really going to tell people they can't use it? And I think this relates, just the last thing I'll say is law school policies, right? And the law school policies generally tend to be that you can't use these tools, right? And it's, again, you can't enforce these policies because it's really unclear. I mean, does that mean you can't do a Google search because generative AI pops up at the top? But it's, it's wrong-headed, and it's really protecting faculty from thinking through, well, what does this mean, right? What do my students, what do they need to learn in this class? How does AI change that? How can AI help in that space? But I think that, we're doing a disservice to our students with some of the policies we have in law schools right now.
I think it's a great point. I really like this. A lot of people know that in civil cases, like family matters or immigration, things like that, 80% of Americans can't afford or don't have access to a lawyer. So their next best option is basically guessing, right? And as we know, the legal system is really complicated. So generative AI is at least better than guessing, if not as good as an actual lawyer. So
well, especially the systems created by legal aid organizations. And then here's another area where it can be intentional, right? Support these legal aid organizations. Law schools partner with them, try to improve funding for some of those initiatives.
That's a great. Anyone else want to weigh in on how to be deliberate about making sure any benefits are widely shared?
I just think it's really important that we not allow these tools to be an excuse to fail to create equitable systems of power and authority. I mean, I hear you in the sense of like, what's better than nothing? I don't know what the consequences of, say, bad legal information as opposed to nothing. This is not something I've studied. We're seeing this in the medical context right now, where we've got a lot of bad information flowing out of, for instance, OpenAI products that could do a lot of harm, and also. The line of accountability becomes non-existent, right? When you contrast this with human professionals, and that matters. So I think we need to walk this line of making sure that I think there are a lot of spaces in our society. I mean, healthcare is a profoundly unjust system in this society, and when we throw an AI at it and say, oh well, maybe the AI will fix it, or we say, well, climate change is a big problem. Maybe the AIs will fix that someday. This is a total withdrawal of responsibility. And that, again, is, I think it comes back to that sovereignty question that you raised, too, is like anytime we are withdrawing our responsibility in any process that has consequences, that's a red flag about, using AI well, right? We are not using AI well if we're taking a system that had some kind of accountability, even if it was broken, and replacing it with a still broken system that just subtracts the accountability.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I mean, it lays bare that it's a social and political choice to not subsidize legal aid to provide actual lawyers.
Or to address climate change, or to have an equitable healthcare system.
So, like everything, it's a balance.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to weigh in on the equitable question? All right, well, in our last 10 minutes, we want to open it up to the audience for questions. Per usual, we want to open it up to a student for our first question, and I see Max over here.
Yeah, thanks for the wonderful panel. Question on the context of using IOL in the education context in particular. I feel like we're so close to the moment with rising student loans and a lot of economic anxiety of like people in Palo Alto saying like, don't invest in, a college tuition saving for your kid, buy them a Mac Mini and a cloud subscription. Like I can hear that. And I don't think, I'm not saying I agree with that, but I don't think that's entirely unfounded that like, if the purpose of education is to skill people for the world, but you're giving them a blank chatbot LLM interface with no guidance on how to use it well, no structure, what's the benefit of people enrolling in higher education? What are the critical thinking skills that we can teach and structure around LLMs? I mean, at a superficial level, I've just like given the analogy of like you open up in a school or corporations like Office 365. They have templates for how a memo looks, things like that. How are ways that maybe particularly education can structure AI helpfully so that students aren't on their own?
This is a great point, and thank you for bringing this up. And I will say the burden is on us, people like me, to think critically about this, to think how to give the students not just the specific skills, which you were talking about, also more general skills so you can adapt whatever comes along, so you can be confident that however the future plays out, you have the higher level skills to thrive.
I think we're definitely at a transition point. I mean, universities, colleges are really struggling to keep up with how do we transform ourselves. I mean, and the light is shining on the flawed assessments that we've been doing for decades. So I'm jumping out of bed every day as an instructional designer, curriculum strategist, excited actually that now we have the potential to make that change, but it is slow going. And so wanting to just double click on Daniel around his process versus product, right, approach to all of his assessments now. That's what we need to be seeing in the classrooms, and we are going to start seeing that. But what you're uncovering is outside society, outside of the walled garden, they don't trust that that is even happening. And they're in a place of anxiety and urgency, and it does make sense that that narrative is there. But that's where we're going to need to catch up, and I agree with you on our responsibility.
I agree with Harry completely that it's the institution's responsibility, the individual instructor's responsibility, but students have a voice in this and a responsibility as well. And I think students should spend more time thinking about, hey, we're the customers, we're paying for this, and what do we think and how should our voice be heard? But you also have a responsibility, and this is kind of like the top-down, bottom-up version of that. Hey, you're closest to thinking about what you want to do in your career, and we should be giving you the tools and helping train you, but you need to be investing some time in this also and thinking about, well, what other things should I learn? Where do I really want to go with this? How's this going to help me? How might it hinder my development? So I think, there's a role for students in this as well.
I would like to take some of that onus off of students. I think there are other governments that are thinking about this way more proactively and that are actually modeling out the future of work and what types of, within a job, what tasks are likely to be automated and subsumed by agents and what aren't, and are starting to think really proactively around how to prepare education systems and workforces for that future. And that is not on any one individual's onus to figure out because it is complex. It involves really, really spurious projections and scenario planning. But I think if our government isn't going to take that on because the priority is just selling and growing GDP today, then there are going to have to be bodies in the United States that fill that in and really shape education systems to support broader society and students, not just tomorrow, but in 10 years.
Again, I'll come back to the point about the silver lining of the apocalypse of the college essay as being a kind of a bullshit detector. It just takes me back to what is education about? I think of Socrates, who didn't write a college essay once. Plato had to take notes. Also spent so much time talking about friendship, talking about the relation. And there's some kind of wacky stuff from our, maybe some of our perspectives in there. But it's really emphasizes the sense that the point of education is to develop right relationship, and knowledge and wisdom flow through that relationship. And it's not really about, like the information that you accumulate during that process matters, but the relationship is the heart of it. And this is in Confucius and Paulo Freire, take your pick. Relationship is at the heart. And I think to me that comes back to that question of what it means when your university imposes a corporate monopoly on you. Is that right relationship? The same day that deal was announced here at CU, I got an email from BBSD, the school system where my kids go, that they were banning it. They were banning ChatGPT from their network. And, that was, I'm not saying that we want to necessarily ban it, but to say that what does right relationship look like with these companies? How do we help people navigate a healthy relationship, a relationship in which they have power, in which we are able to sit and work through the thorny questions together? So to me, that's it. In some respects, this apocalypse has been an important reminder of that, to break some of the rote and to get back to basics.
We've got a question right here. If we could get a microphone.
I think they got a microphone right over there for her.
Oh, okay. We'll come to you afterwards.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Molly. I'm a freshman in undergrad, and I have a question specifically about AI as not necessarily a replacement for human thought, but more like shifting the focus of AI as a cognitive prosthetic, specifically for students with learning disabilities or those from non-English speaking backgrounds. How can we shift the focus to how AI can equalize the student experience, especially like with students who have cerebral palsy, and in the case of Eric Dane, like enable students to be able to be equally able in the classroom?
Well, you bring up a beautiful opportunity, and that's that AI can absolutely become a collaborative tool for any mental existence. I'm really excited to see that possibility. I know it was a great story of a community college instructor who had a student who was on the spectrum, walked in the class and said something entirely inappropriate, impulsive, went back to AI that night and told them what had happened and got, what should I do about it? And came back the next day and orated an apology and got a standing ovation. There was just, again, a collaborative opportunity there, and the faculty immediately, and this was right when it came out, centered the AI in the classroom and asked the students to say, was that okay? And when is it not okay? And kind of brought them to the table, so.
If I could just say, again, I think this is a case where we have to be really careful about using the AI as a Band-Aid on unjust circumstances. And one thing I've found as a teacher over the years is that working with students with who experience different kinds of disabling things in a society that is not built for them, is that often the solutions are really social, and they're relational again. And that I think there are a lot of hey, it's cool that we can have subtitles and things like that, and I'm all for the prosthetic and the expansionary view of the human in many respects, but just let us not use this as an excuse to not do the hard work of figuring out how do we make inclusive social spaces, inclusive spaces in terms of how power is distributed and how we prioritize our attention and resources. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, excellent points and excellent question. And our final question is right here.
You asked earlier who's a lawyer and who's not a lawyer. Well, I was a public company co-founder, and I hired a ton of CU students, and I actually had 4 lawyers from CU reporting to me, and I did all the external law and all of that. And law was always at CU about educating for clerking and policy, and I think we now have some business law, so I look at this from an employer. And as an employer today, any institution that did not educate students on how to use AI to improve the workplace would not be somebody I would hire, period. And I've heard Todd, I'm also a CU trustee. And we've asked as trustees, what is CU's policy on AI within education? You talked about the court systems. How much does it cost for you to have somebody review a land use policy per hour? Lawyers are not affordable to most people. You guys are responsible for bridging that gap, and perhaps maybe legal rates go down and more people start to use lawyers because they're using capabilities that allow them to process more things and work on more important stuff instead of saying, oh, I have to do another distributor contract, and you're talking to your lawyer out of CU who doesn't even know what a distributor contract is, or most favored nation clauses, or that you just did one last week. So I kind of want to know what your aha moment would be, or was, that you went, wow, this is something I need to put into my practice, and this is something I need to teach to my students.
Well, I'll just weigh in here. So I've been studying this for a long time, and I literally have my own benchmarks where I test AI against various legal reasoning tests, and in simple terms, they went from bad to good to very good over a very short period of time. And so that was my aha moment, seeing the AI being able to do tasks that for 20 years it previously never could do.
Yeah, I think I was a lot more bullish on AI than Harry was before the latest models come up. We're pretty much on the same page now. But I mean, even before these latest tools came out, there were a lot of opportunities to create rules-driven systems. I mentioned technology system review, but even the contract review tools were pretty darn good before large language models came out, and now they're better. So yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really important point, and like how are we going to? It's not, when I talk about this, I mostly spoke about individuals, but there's a lot of small businesses and startups, and this goes to the Jevons paradox idea that Harry talked about earlier. I mean, a lot of lawyers are really threatened by this, but I think, there's tons of opportunities, and it forces the lawyers and instructors, educators to really think about, well, what is the value that a human lawyer really provides, right? And how does a machine supplement some of those things that the human lawyers are doing? I see lots of problems that are not being addressed in the world. I don't think lawyers should be afraid there's not opportunities to, do things that are meaningful in society. But if they don't keep up with using these tools, I think, there are more and more employers like you who those are important questions to them. And, we're not preparing our students properly if we don't address these things.
Well, please join me in thanking my panel for a really thoughtful discussion here.